They don't campaign. They don't debate. They don't appear on television. But their decisions move markets, start wars, collapse economies. And you've never voted for them. This is the Quiet Files. And tonight, we look at the invisible hand. Power does not need permission. It does not need applause. And it does not need to be seen. The most dangerous influence is the one that operates without a name, without a logo, without a ballot. You won't find them campaigning. You won't see them arguing on television. You won't hear their voices in public debate. But their fingerprints are everywhere. In the sudden crash of a currency, in the quiet approval of a military contract, in the unexpected war that experts somehow predicted years in advance, before the headlines, before the outrage, before the vote. There are meetings, private rooms, soundproof walls, long tables where no cameras are allowed, agendas printed without public record. Not illegal, not theatrical, just insulated. Influence rarely looks like domination. It looks like recommendation. It looks like research funding. It looks like advisory councils and strategic guidance. But when the same institutions write the reports, fund the experts, brief the policymakers, and invest in the outcomes, you begin to see something else. A pattern, a circle, a network so interconnected that opposing sides often share the same back channels. Wars are declared in public, but defense contracts are negotiated in advance. Markets collapse unexpectedly, but contingency plans were drafted years before. This isn't chaos. Chaos is unpredictable. This feels coordinated, not by a single mastermind, not by a cartoon villain in a hidden bunker, but by something colder, a collective interest, a shared understanding, an agreement without signatures. The public sees elections, they see debates, they see conflict. But behind those performances, the framework often remains untouched. Policies shift slightly, leaders change faces, but the direction rarely strays far from the blueprint. That is the invisible hand. Not a myth whispered in basements, not a fantasy born from paranoia, but a reality of concentrated power operating in spaces you were never meant to enter. And once you recognize the pattern, you stop asking who is in charge, and you start asking, who benefits every time the world shifts? If power were random, history would look different. Crashes would surprise everyone. Wars would erupt without warning. Policies would contradict long-term interests. But that's not what we see. We see preparedness, contingency plans drafted years before crisis, forecasts that read like blueprints. Before a market collapses, someone already bet against it. Before a conflict begins, contracts are already structured. Before legislation passes, advisory papers have already shaped the language. Coincidence? Maybe. But coincidence repeated across decades begins to resemble design. The public sees reaction. The insiders operate on anticipation. Because real influence does not chase events. It positions itself ahead of them. Imagine sitting in a room where global risk models are discussed in private, where economic instability is mapped years in advance, where geopolitical tension is analyzed like a chessboard. Now imagine having the capital, the connections, and the access to act on that information before the public ever hears a whisper. That isn't magic. It isn't supernatural. It's leverage. And leverage, in the right hands, can shape entire continents. The invisible hand doesn't need to control every decision. It only needs to guide the critical ones. A policy here, a funding stream there, a narrative amplified, a dissenting voice quietly sidelined. Over time, the direction becomes predictable, not because the world is chaotic, but because the steering rarely changes hands. Different presidents, different parties, different headlines, same financial backers, same advisory circles, same long-term beneficiaries. And if you follow the money long enough, you stop asking who won the election and start asking who funded both sides. This is not about secret robes or hidden layers. It's about insulation, access, and the quiet understanding among powerful people that stability for them does not always mean stability for you. The scariest part? They don't need to conspire in dark basements. They attend conferences. They publish white papers. They donate to foundations. They advise administrations. In plain sight. And once you see it, you realize something unsettling. The world may not be controlled, but it is carefully managed. And management is a form of power most people never notice. Power does not only move markets, it moves perception. Because whoever controls the story controls the reaction. The average person does not witness global negotiations. They do not sit in policy briefings. They do not read intelligence assessments. They see headlines, and headlines are curated. Notice how certain crises dominate every screen for weeks, while others barely flicker across the bottom ticker. Notice how language shifts: collateral damage, necessary intervention, market correction. Words soften reality. Words redirect anger. Words assign blame. The narrative doesn't need to lie, it only needs to frame. If you define the problem, you influence the solution. If you repeat the message long enough, it becomes common sense. And once something becomes common sense, it stops being questioned. Major media outlets compete publicly. Different logos, different personalities, different political leanings. But behind the curtain, ownership often overlaps. Investment firms hold stakes across rivals. Advertising revenue comes from the same corporate giants. Conflict on the surface, consolidation underneath. The invisible hand does not need to dictate every word. It only needs to influence which voices are amplified and which are quietly buried beneath the algorithm. Outrage is profitable. Fear is profitable. Division is profitable. A distracted population rarely asks structural questions. A divided population rarely unites long enough to challenge long-term direction. So the screen lights up. Panels argue. Feeds scroll endlessly. And while attention is pulled left and right, the deeper decisions move forward undisturbed. This is not hypnosis. It is saturation. Flood the space with noise, and silence becomes invisible. Ask yourself this: how many times have you reacted to a story before asking who benefits from your reaction? The invisible hand does not demand obedience. It cultivates belief. And belief is the most efficient form of control ever invented. Control does not eliminate choice. It designs it. The most stable systems do not remove options. They narrow them. Look at elections. Campaigns appear fierce. Debates feel explosive. Sides divide sharply. But step back. Notice the funding pipelines, the shared donors, the overlapping advisory circles, different personalities, different rhetoric, but often, the same economic architecture remains untouched. Policy shifts at the edges, taxes adjust, regulations tighten or loosen, but the core financial framework rarely fractures. That is not necessarily fraud, it is insulation. True power protects its foundation first. Now look at the marketplace. Walk into any supermarket, an entire aisle of cereal brands, rows of competing labels, different colors, different slogans. But behind the packaging, many trace back to the same parent corporations. Competition on the shelf, consolidation at the top. Streaming platforms, social networks, news outlets, banks, insurance providers, a web of subsidiaries and holding companies so layered that rivalry becomes performance. The illusion of choice is powerful, because when people feel they are choosing freely, they rarely question the boundaries of the selection. Imagine a corridor with 10 doors. You are told you may open any one of them. You feel empowered. What you are not told is that all 10 doors lead to the same building. That is structural influence, not domination. Design. The invisible hand does not need to force the outcome. It only needs to shape the environment in which outcomes occur. Limit the menu. Frame the debate. Define what is realistic. Label alternatives as extreme. Soon, the range of acceptable ideas becomes narrow, and anything outside that range feels dangerous. This is how systems endure, not through visible chains, but through invisible walls. And the most unsettling part? Many of those walls are internal. Beliefs formed, limits accepted, options assumed. The world appears loud, divided, competitive, but at the structural level, it often moves with remarkable consistency. The question is no longer, are we allowed to choose? The question becomes, who built the menu? The strongest cage is not made of steel. It is made of belief. No system survives long by force alone. Force creates resistance. Resistance creates fracture. But belief creates loyalty. And loyalty is far more durable than fear. Over time, people begin to defend the very structures that restrict them, not because they are foolish, but because stability feels safer than uncertainty. Questioning the system means questioning foundations, careers, identities, worldviews. It is easier to argue over personalities than to examine architecture. Easier to blame individuals than to confront patterns. And so, the debate stays loud, endless, emotional, while the deeper framework remains quietly intact. The invisible hand does not silence critics, it absorbs them. It turns outrage into content, dissent into branding, rebellion into merchandise. Even resistance can be monetized. Think about that. How many movements begin as disruption, only to be packaged, sponsored, and sold back to the public? When every emotion becomes profitable, the system does not fear anger. It studies it. It measures engagement, tracks reactions, learns from patterns, and adapts. Soon, the cage becomes self-maintaining. People police one another, correct one another, attack one another, all while believing they are defending truth. This is the final layer of control, not suppression, participation. When the boundaries of acceptable thought are internalized, the system no longer needs to enforce them externally, because the walls are no longer outside you, they are inside. And once a cage becomes invisible, it becomes almost impossible to escape. The unsettling question is not whether power exists. It always has. The unsettling question is this: If the invisible hand truly guides direction, how much of it operates because we allow it to? And how much of it survives because we defend it, without ever realizing we are inside it? There may not be a single throne hidden in the dark, no secret crown passed between shadows, but there is something quieter, something older. Concentrated power, protected power, reinforcing itself across generations, not through dramatic conspiracies, but through access, capital, influence. Through rooms most will never enter, conversations never recorded, decisions never televised. The invisible hand does not need to control every outcome. It only needs to shape the boundaries, define the acceptable, frame the debate, design the menu. And once the boundaries are drawn, the rest unfolds naturally. Markets rise, wars ignite, policies pass, and we argue over the surface while the structure remains untouched. But here is the truth that matters most. Power persists not only because it exists, it persists because it is rarely challenged at its foundation. We defend teams, we defend brands, we defend personalities. But how often do we question architecture? How often do we ask who benefits, not from a single event, but from the pattern itself? The invisible hand may not be a villain. It may not even be coordinated in the way we imagine. It may simply be what happens when power accumulates faster than accountability, and when influence becomes generational. It stops feeling like power. It starts feeling like normal. That is the quietest danger of all, when structure becomes invisible and invisibility becomes accepted. This is not a call to paranoia. It is a call to awareness, because the moment you recognize the pattern, you stop reacting to noise and start observing design. And once enough people observe design, design can change. This has been the Quiet Files. And the next time the world shifts suddenly, ask yourself one question. Was it chaos, or was it steered?